Hey sisters, I'm reading Women Who Run with the Wolves, and chapter Self-Preservation, Leg Traps, and it's trap number 7, Faking It, Trying to be Good, Normalizing the Abnormal. So we're talking about the girl in the red shoes, and here's Anne Sexton's poem that she wrote about the fairy tale, the same name. I stand in the ring in the dead city and tie on the red shoes. They are not mine, they are my mother's, and her mother's before. Handed down like an heirloom, but hidden like shameful letters. The house and the street where they belong are hidden, and all the women too are hidden. And I'm wearing my mom's house coat. Had a nice bath. Doing the work, revealing. Okay, trying to be good, orderly, and compliant in the face of inner or outer peril, or in order to hide a critical psychic or real-life situation, desouls a woman. It cuts her from her own knowing. It cuts her from her ability to act, like the child in the tale who does not object out loud, who tries to hide her starvation, who tries to make it seem as though nothing is burning in her. Modern women have the same disorder, normalizing the abnormal. Okay, they did a study in the 60s to talk about and to look at the flight instinct in humans. So, half the bottom of a large cage was wired so that a dog placed in the cage would receive a shock each time it set foot on the right side. The dog quickly learned to stay on the left side of the cage. Next, the left side of the cage was wired for the same purpose, and the right side was safe from shocks. The dog reoriented quickly and learned to stay on the right side of the cage. Then the entire floor of the cage was wired to give random shocks, so that no matter where the dog lay or stood, it would eventually receive a shock. The dog acted confused at first, and then it panicked. Finally, the dog gave up, lay down, taking the shocks as they came, no longer trying to escape them or outsmart them. The experiment wasn't over. Next, the cage door was opened. This scientist expected the dog to rush out, but it did not flee. Even though it could vacate the cage at will, the dog lay there being randomly shocked. From this, scientists speculated that when a creature is exposed to violence, it will tend to adapt to the disturbance, so that when the violence ceases or the creature is allowed its freedom, the healthy instinct to flee is hugely diminished and the creature stays put instead. This normalization of violence and what they termed learned helplessness, that influences women to not only stay with drunken mates, abusive employers, and groups that exploit and harass them, but causes them to feel unable to rise up to support the things they believe in with all their hearts, their art, their loves, their lifestyle, their politics. The normalization of the abnormal, even when there is clear evidence that it is to one's own detriment to do so, applies to all battering of the physical, emotional, creative, spiritual, and instinctive natures. Women face this issue anytime they are stunned into doing anything less than defending their soul lives from invasive projections, cultural, psychic, or otherwise. Psychically, we become used to the shocks aimed at our wild natures. We adapt to violence against the psyche's knowing nature. We try to be good while normalizing the abnormal. As a result, we lose our power to flee. We lose our power to lobby for the elements of soul and life we find most valuable. When we are obsessed with the red shoes, all kinds of important personal, cultural, and environmental matters fall by the wayside. There is such a loss of meaning when one gives up the life made by hand, and all manner of injuries to psyche, nature, culture, family, and so forth are then allowed to occur. The harm to nature is concomitant with the stunning of the psyches of humans. They are not and cannot be seen as separate from one another. When one group talks about how funny, we're not supposed to talk about it. When one group talks about how wrong the wild is, and the other group argues that the wild has been wrong, something is drastically wrong. In the instinctive psyche, the wild woman looks out on the forest and sees a home for herself and all humans, yet others may look at the same forest and imagine it barren of trees and their pockets bursting with money. That's the way it is here mostly. These represent serious splits in the ability to live and let live so that all can live. These represent serious splits in the ability to live and let live so that all can live. When I was a child in the 1950s, in the early days of industrial disgraces against the earth, an oil barge sank in the Chicago basin of Lake Michigan. After a day at the beach, mothers scrubbed their little children with the same verve they usually reserved for scrubbing wooden floors, for their children were stained with oil globs. The oil wreck oozed a goo that traveled in great sheets like floating islands as long and wide as city blocks. When these collided with jetties, they broke into goblets and sank into the sand and drifted into shore under the waves. For years, swimmers could not swim without being covered with black muck. Children building castles would suddenly scoop up a handful of rubbery oil. Lovers could no longer roll in the sand. Dogs, birds, water life, and people all suffered. I remember feeling that my cathedral had been bombed. Injury to instinct, normalizing the abnormal, is what allowed mothers to wipe the stains of that oil spill, and later the further sins of factories, refineries, and smelters off their little children, their laundry, the insides of their loved ones as best they could, and while confused and worried, the woman effectively cut away their rightful rage. Not all, but most, had become used to not being able to intervene in shocking events. There were formidable punishments for breaking silence, for fleeing the cage, for pointing out wrongs, for demanding change. We can see from similar events that have occurred over our lifetimes that when women do not speak, when not enough people speak, the voice of the wild woman becomes silent, and therefore the world becomes silent of the natural and wild too. Silent eventually of wolf and bear and raptor, silent of singing and dancings and creations, silent of loving, repairing, and holding, bereft of clean air and water and the voices of consciousness. But back in those times, and too often today, even though women were infused with a yearning for a wild freedom, they continued outwardly to rub SOS on porcelain, using caustic cleaners, staying, as Sylvia Plath put it, tied to their Bentrix washing machines. There they washed and rinsed their clothes in water too hot for human touch and dreamt of a different world. When the instincts were injured, humans will normalize assault after assault, acts of injustice and destruction towards themselves, their offspring, their loved ones, their land, and even their gods. This normalization of the shocking and abusive is reversed by repairing injured instinct. An instinct is repaired, the integral wild nature returns. Instead of dancing into the forest in the red shoes until all the life becomes tortured and meaningless, we can return to the handmade life, the holy mindful life. We make our own shoes, walk our own walk, talk our own talk. While it is true that there is much to learn by dissolving one's projection, you're mean, you hurt me, and looking at how we are mean to ourselves, how we hurt ourselves, this should definitely not be the end of the inquiry. While it is true that there is much to learn by dissolving one's projections, we read that. The trap within the trap is thinking that everything is solved by dissolving the projections and finding consciousness in ourselves. This is sometimes true and sometimes not. Rather, this either or paragram, it's either something amiss out there or something awry with us. It is more useful to use an and model. Here is the internal issue and here is the external issue. This paragram shows a whole inquiry and far more healing in all directions. This paragram supports women to question the status quo with confidence and to not only look at themselves but also the world that is accidentally, unconsciously, or maliciously pressuring them. The and paradigm is not meant to be used as a blaming model, a blaming of self or other, but is rather a way of weighing and judging accountability, both inner and outer, and what needs to be changed, applied for. It stops fragmentation when a woman seeks to mend all within her reach, neither slighting her own needs nor turning away from the world. Somehow many women are able to maintain themselves in a captured state, but they live a half-life or a quarter life or even a nth life. They manage, but they may become bitter to the end of their days. They may feel hopeless and often like a babe who has cried and cried with no human aid forthcoming. They may become deathly silent and despairing. Fatigue and resignation follow. The cage is locked. Okay, well, up to you all. Doing our work. Had a nice bath. Amanda did my hair.